The rain fell sideways, slamming against the windshield as Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. Streetlights flickered in the distance, half the city already swallowed in darkness. Beside him in the passenger seat, his 8-year-old daughter. Emma clutched her backpack, her small hands wrapped tight around the straps. "Almost home, kiddo," Daniel said, forcing calm into his voice, though his chest pounded. Floodwater lapped at the tires as he pulled into their worn-down apartment complex. He scooped Emma out, carrying her through the sheets of rain, his work boots splashing in rising puddles. By the time they reached their unit on the 3rd floor, both were drenched. Inside, the place groaned under the weight of the storm. The wind howled through cracks in the windows, and the ceiling rattled with each thunderclap. Daniel moved quickly, lighting candles, setting blankets on the couch, checking the flashlight batteries. He kept his movements steady, deliberate, because Emma's wide eyes followed every one. "You're safe, sweetheart," he whispered, brushing back her wet hair. Emma nodded, trying to believe him. For a moment, the storm was only noise outside. The crash of branches, the rattle of rain. Then came the knock, sharp, urgent. Daniel froze. At this hour, in this weather, no one visited. He set the flashlight down and moved to the door cautiously. Another knock, louder this time. He peered through the peephole, and what he saw made his breath hitch. Victoria Hale, his boss, the CEO of Hale Enterprises. The woman he'd only ever seen commanding boardrooms and headlines, stood there drenched, her tailored coat clinging like dead weight. In one arm she held a trembling little boy no older than 6. Her other hand pounded the door again. "Please," she called out, voice nearly lost to the wind. "We need help." Daniel blinked, torn between disbelief and instinct. Victoria Hale, worth billions, untouchable in her glass towers, was on his doorstep. Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy? Who is it?" Daniel hesitated, then unlatched the door. The CEO stumbled inside, collapsing against the frame, rain pooling at her heels. Her son buried his face in her shoulder, coughing from the cold. "Car broke down. Driver never came back," Victoria gasped. I didn't know where else to go." The room seemed to shrink. Emma's eyes darted between her father and the soaked strangers. Daniel shut the door against the storm, locking it tight. For a long beat, silence hung heavy, except for the hammer of rain outside, the janitor and the CEO. 2 worlds colliding under candlelight. Daniel stared at her, questions piling up, but only one slipped out. "Why here?" Victoria's desperate eyes met his. "Because you're the only one I can trust right now." The air turned electric, the storm outside suddenly no louder than the pounding in Daniel's chest. The storm rattled the windows like fists against glass, but inside Daniel's apartment the silence was heavier than the thunder. Victoria Hale, his billionaire CEO, stood dripping on the worn linoleum floor. Her son pressed tightly against her side. She looked nothing like the untouchable figure he'd seen in glossy magazines or striding past security guards in the corporate tower. Her makeup had run, her hair was plastered to her face, and her eyes flickered with something he never thought he'd see in her. Fear. "My car stalled in the flood," she explained quickly, her voice trembling. "The driver went to get help. He never came back. I didn't know where else to go." Daniel shifted his weight, uneasy. This was his boss, the woman whose signature could end his employment with a stroke of a pen. He'd spent years invisible. To her, just another name on the payroll under maintenance. Now she was here asking for shelter. He glanced at Emma. Her big eyes moved from him to Victoria's shivering boy. Without hesitation, she pulled the blanket from her shoulders and walked toward him. "Here," Emma said softly, draping it around the boy. "It's warm." The boy looked up, his small face pale. "Thank you," he whispered. That single gesture broke something fragile in the air. Victoria blinked, as if surprised that kindness could come from such a simple place. She crouched, tucking the blanket tighter around her son, then looked at Daniel. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't desperate," she said. "Just for tonight, until the storm passes." Daniel hesitated, torn between instinct and caution. His heart tugged at the sight of the boy shivering, but his mind screamed at the absurdity. His CEO, in his tiny, cracked-walled apartment, she rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling. "All right, just for tonight." Victoria nodded, relief washing over her face. She guided her son to the couch, where Emma quickly rearranged pillows and another blanket. The two children sat side by side, shy but curious, whispering softly to each other. Daniel busied himself with boiling water on the small gas stove, pouring it into mugs with instant cocoa mix. He handed one to Victoria. She held it in both hands, sipping slowly, her eyes darting around the modest room filled with Emma's crayon drawings taped on the fridge. "It's warm," she murmured, her voice softer now. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying her. She was stripped of her glass office armor, no boardroom table to hide behind, no assistants rushing to smooth her path. Just a mother, in trouble, clinging to her child. The storm outside roared, pressing them together in a silence broken only by the children's laughter, as Emma showed her new friend one of her drawings. Daniel's jaw tightened. Shelter had been offered, but the tension wasn't gone. This night would be long, and something in his gut told him it was only the beginning. By midnight, the storm had swallowed the city whole. The apartment flickered once, then went black. As the last current of electricity died, Emma yelped, clutching her stuffed rabbit tight. Daniel struck a match, lighting a candle on the counter. The flame spread shadows across the room, casting long shapes of the four figures huddled inside. Rain pounded the glass like fists, and water crept higher along the streets below. Victoria Hale sat rigid on the couch, her son pressed against her side. Her phone screen glowed faintly in her palm before it blinked dead. She stared at it a long moment, as if willing it to come back to life. "No signal," she murmured, her voice tight. "No cars. Nothing." Daniel poured canned soup into a pot on the gas stove. He stirred slowly, letting the steam rise into the cramped room. "Welcome to my world," he said quietly. "Power outages happen here more than you think." Victoria glanced at him, unused to hearing defiance. But here, without her office, her assistants, her empire, she had no leverage. She was just a mother clutching her boy in the dark. When Daniel set bowls on the table, she hesitated before taking one. The soup was thin, salty, but warm. She sipped anyway, exhaustion softening her face. Her eyes fell on the fridge. Dozens of crayon drawings taped to the surface. Crooked houses, stick figures holding hands, suns with too many rays. Emma's world, bright against the cracked walls. "Your daughter draws a lot," Victoria said, her tone softening. Daniel smiled faintly. "It's how she makes sense of things. Every picture's a promise I try to keep." For a moment, the storm faded to background noise. The children slurped their soup, giggling when Emma made silly faces. Victoria let out a sound, half laugh, half sigh. It startled her, as if she'd forgotten how. But peace never lasted long here. A muffled voice drifted through the walls. Then, another. Male voices, low and urgent, coming from the hallway. Emma's head lifted, her small ears sharper than the adults. "Daddy," she whispered, "there are men outside." Daniel froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. He set it down and motioned for silence. Through the thin walls, the words became clearer. "Check that door next. People leave things behind when they run. Yeah, anything valuable, we take it." Victoria's eyes widened. She pulled her son closer, her hands trembling. "Looters?" Daniel nodded once, his jaw tight. He rose quietly, taking the hammer. He kept near the door. His movements were calm, practiced, like someone who had lived through nights like this before. "Stay quiet. Don't open your mouth," he whispered to the kids. Emma clutched her rabbit, eyes wide with fear. Victoria's gaze darted to him. For the first time, the woman who commanded boardrooms looked small, helpless. And Daniel, the janitor she barely noticed in her empire, was the one holding the line. A heavy knock rattled a door 2 units down. Footsteps moved closer. Their turn was coming. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, stopping just outside their door. Emma whimpered, but Daniel placed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. The handle rattled once, twice. Then a curse. Daniel slid the bolt across, locking it tight. "They'll move on," he whispered, more for the children than for Victoria. But Victoria wasn't calm. She clutched her son to her chest, her breaths shallow, every muscle rigid. "What if they don't?" she whispered back, panic dripping into every word. Daniel knelt, speaking low. "Then we make sure they can't get in." He moved with quiet precision, dragging the small dining table toward the door, bracing it against the frame. Victoria hesitated, then followed his lead, pushing a heavy chair alongside it. Their hands brushed briefly as they worked, two strangers, thrown into survival, breathing in sync with the hammering storm outside. For the first time since arriving, Victoria looked at Daniel not as an employee, but as an equal in the fight to keep their children safe. When the footsteps finally faded, down the hall the silence returned, deeper, heavier. The kids leaned against each other, half asleep with exhaustion. Victoria exhaled shakily. I can't believe this is happening. My son, he's never—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Daniel said nothing, just kept adjusting the barricade until he was satisfied. Then he sat across from her, his posture steady. In the dim candlelight, she looked smaller, stripped of the armor of wealth and titles. "So you think I've had it easy, don't you?" she whispered. "But my husband left us years ago, walked out when the responsibility got too heavy. I've been raising him alone ever since." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Daniel glanced at Emma, curled up under her blanket. His jaw tightened. "I know what that's like." Victoria studied him, curiosity flickering behind tired eyes. For a moment, the distance between CEO and janitor seemed to shrink, both bound by the weight of single parenthood. But then something broke the fragile quiet. Daniel had been outlining a plan under his breath. How they'd ration food, how they'd check water levels, how to reinforce the windows if needed. The way he spoke, precise, detailed, layered in strategy, wasn't the language of a man who mopped floors for a living. At one point he muttered, "Under common law, if looters force entry, technically they'd be liable for—" He stopped, himself too late. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Common law." Daniel froze. She tilted her head, suspicion rising. "That's not how janitors talk. Who are you, really?" The storm groaned against the walls, but the silence between them was louder. For the first time since stepping into his apartment, Victoria wasn't just seeing the man in front of her, she was questioning him. And in her gaze, Daniel realized his carefully buried past was beginning to surface. The candlelight flickered across Daniel's face, shadows deepening the lines carved by years of quiet sacrifice. Victoria sat opposite him, her son curled against her lap, but her eyes never left him. "You speak like someone who's studied law," she said softly, suspicion cutting through the storm's howl outside. Daniel avoided her gaze, his thumb brushing along the handle of the hammer resting near his leg. "I read things," he muttered, but the silence pressed harder, and memories he'd fought to bury clawed their way to the surface. 10 years earlier, he saw himself in a crowded university library, surrounded by thick legal texts. Professors praised his arguments, classmates whispered his name. He was the scholarship kid who was going places, the one who was supposed to rewrite his family's story. Then came the phone call. His wife, Anna. Complications after birth. The time he reached the hospital, Emma was in an incubator fighting for breath and Anna was gone. He had walked out of the courtroom internship the next day. Never went back. One future ended, the moment another life began. Back in the present, Victoria's voice snapped him out of it. "Why throw it all away?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on Emma, sleeping peacefully under her blanket. "Because some promises matter more than careers." Her expression softened briefly, a flash of recognition crossing her face. She too had been abandoned to carry the weight of parenthood alone. But before the moment could settle, the storm delivered a new terror. A violent crash echoed from the hallway, wood splintering, voices rising. "They're still here," Victoria whispered, panic lacing her words. Daniel was already on his feet, hammer in hand. He pressed his back to the door, every muscle coiled, listening as the looters worked their way closer. The thud of boots, the slam of another door broken open. Emma stirred at the noise, her little hands clutching the rabbit tighter. Daniel crouched, whispering urgently, "Stay quiet, baby. Don't be afraid. Daddy's here." The sound of men shouting filtered through the thin walls. "Check that unit. People always leave food." Victoria's grip on her son tightened until her knuckles whitened. For the first time, she didn't see a janitor in Daniel. She saw a man standing guard, someone who would bleed before he let danger through that door. The pounding grew closer. The children whimpered. Daniel raised the hammer, his breath steady, eyes locked on the doorknob. Victoria's chest heaved as she whispered, "You're not who you pretend to be." Daniel didn't answer. He simply braced himself as the footsteps stopped right outside. The looters jiggled the handle once, twice, then a harsh laugh. "Locked. Move on." The voices faded, their steps echoing down the hall. Daniel didn't lower the hammer right away. He kept listening, waiting, every nerve alive. And in that tense silence, Victoria understood. This man's past held more than she realized, and it wasn't done haunting him yet. The first crash against the door rattled the entire frame. Emma screamed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, while Victoria's son buried his face against her chest. Daniel's eyes snapped to the lock. He dropped his shoulder into the door just as another violent shove sent it creaking inward. "Hold it!" he barked. Victoria moved before she could think, pressing her back against the wood beside him, her arms trembling as she pushed with all her strength. The kids sobbed behind them, the storm outside no longer the loudest threat. A voice snarled from the hallway. "Open up! We know you're in there!" The knob twisted violently. Another slam reverberated through the apartment. Daniel's muscles strained, sweat beading at his temple. He braced his hammer in one hand, ready if the barricade gave way. Victoria's breath came fast, panicked, but she held. Their shoulders pressed side by side against the door, strangers bound by survival. Inside the room, Emma cried out, "Daddy!" Daniel gritted his teeth. "I'm here, baby. Don't let go of your brother. Stay down." His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with fury. Another crash. The wood splintered slightly, sending a crack through the frame. Daniel cursed under his breath. For a moment he thought they wouldn't hold. Then, faint at first but growing, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The looters froze. One cursed, "Cops are coming. Let's move." Footsteps thundered away down the hall, swallowed by the storm. Daniel kept his weight against the door until the last echo faded. Only then did he exhale, every muscle trembling with spent adrenaline. He slowly eased back, lowering the hammer. To his side, Victoria slid down against the wall, clutching her son so tightly he whimpered. Her breaths came in sharp bursts, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. For a long moment the only sound was the storm outside and the quiet sobs of the children. Then Victoria looked at him, not with suspicion, not with the cold superiority she wielded in glass towers, but with raw, unguarded trust. "You didn't even flinch," she whispered. "I've had board members promise me loyalty for years, and they all fold under pressure. But you didn't move." Daniel shook, his head setting the hammer down on the table. "When it's your kids behind you, there's no room to fold." She stared at him, the truth of that sinking deeper than any speech she'd ever heard in a boardroom. The balance between them had shifted. The CEO who once ruled over him now leaned on him for safety, for survival. Daniel lit another candle, placing it near the children. His hands were steady again, his focus back on them. But as Victoria pulled her son close, one thought chilled her. If the storm dragged on, if the looters returned in greater numbers, this fragile alliance might not be enough to keep them alive. The storm had finally slowed to a steady drum on the windows. The children lay asleep on the couch, wrapped in blankets, their soft breaths steadying the room. A single candle flickered on the kitchen table, throwing Daniel and Victoria into a circle of fragile light. Victoria broke the silence first. Her voice was quiet but edged with something sharper. "You don't belong with a mop in your hands, not with the way you handled tonight." Daniel sat still for a moment, staring at the flame. Then he leaned back, his face shadowed, and exhaled slowly. "You're right. I wasn't always a janitor." Victoria straightened. "I used to work in corporate law," Daniel admitted. "Not big, not glamorous, but I was on track. I thought I could actually change things, help people who didn't have a voice. His eyes flicked toward Emma, asleep with her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. His voice cracked. Then my wife died. Emma was just a baby. I took a leave, but when I tried to come back, everything had changed. Victoria's brows furrowed. Changed how? Daniel rubbed his palms together, the shame still raw after all these years. A partner at the firm got caught in a corruption scandal, money laundering, offshore accounts. I had nothing to do with it, but I was the easy scapegoat. They needed someone expendable to take the fall. My name was smeared, blacklisted. No one in the city would touch me. Victoria blinked, stunned. But your file at Hale Enterprises, it lists you as nothing but janitorial staff. Daniel gave a humorless laugh. Of course it does. That's what happens when the system chews you up. You get rewritten as nobody. I stopped fighting it. A paycheck is a paycheck, and Emma's medicine doesn't care what title I used to have. The weight of his words pressed between them. Victoria leaned back, searching his face for any trace of a lie. But all she saw was a man broken and rebuilt by sacrifice. Daniel rose quietly and walked to the fridge. He pulled one of Emma's drawings from beneath a magnet and set it on the table between them. The paper was crinkled at the edges, colored in bright crayons. 2 stick figures, one taller, one smaller, holding hands under a crooked sun. Across the top, in uneven purple letters, "Daddy is my hero." His voice dropped, rough. "This is why I stayed invisible. As long as she sees me as that, nothing else matters." Victoria traced the drawing with her eyes, her throat tightening. She thought of her own son, of boardroom allies who would stab her the first chance they got, of nights spent alone in her penthouse office. She looked back at Daniel, her voice soft. "You gave up everything for her." Daniel nodded, the candlelight catching the exhaustion in his eyes. "And I'd do it again." But before the quiet could settle, a sudden crash echoed in the hallway. Doors slamming, men's voices shouting again. The storm outside might have eased, but the danger inside the building had only just begun. By dawn, the storm had weakened, but the city outside looked like a battlefield. Streets were rivers, cars abandoned, glass scattered like diamonds across sidewalks. Inside Daniel's apartment, the candles had burned low, their wax hardened in small pools. The children still slept on the couch, exhaustion pulling them into dreams, but Victoria sat at the table with her phone in hand. A faint signal had finally returned. Notifications flooded the screen, emails, missed calls, alerts. She scrolled, her face pale in the glow. Then she froze. One subject line stood out in bold, "Emergency session, Hale Enterprises Board." Her thumb tapped, and her eyes raced across the words. Her blood ran cold. Effective immediately, we moved to consider a vote of no confidence. In Victoria Hale citing leadership negligence during crisis. She dropped the phone to the table, her chest tightening. Daniel looked up from the window, where he'd been checking water levels outside. "What is it?" Victoria swallowed hard. "They're moving against me, the board. While the city was drowning, they used the outage as cover to plan a vote. They want me out." Daniel frowned, picking up the phone and reading the email. His jaw clenched. "This isn't just panic. This is a coup." Victoria's hands shook as she pulled up more messages. One name repeated in every thread, every forwarded plan. Her most trusted deputy, Marcus Kane, the man she'd leaned on for years. "No," she whispered, "not him." Daniel studied. "Her," his voice calm but firm. "The closer they are, the easier the knife slips in. You know that better than anyone." Her eyes brimmed with a mix of rage and disbelief. "He was supposed to protect me. He's been with me since day one." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "He's protecting himself. If this vote goes through, they'll bury you, and he'll come out clean. You'll need proof, documents, contracts, anything to show the corruption on their side." Victoria looked at him sharply. "You sound like you've done this before." Daniel didn't flinch. "Because I have. Different names, same game. They chewed me up the same way." Her breathing slowed as his words sank in. In this moment, stripped of storm and fear, she understood. This man knew more about corporate warfare than half her board combined. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. If I lose Hale Enterprises, I lose everything. My legacy, my son's future. I can't let them take it. Daniel nodded. Then you'll need me. The room went still. Victoria's eyes met his across the flickering candlelight. For the first time, she saw him not as janitor, not even as protector, but as an ally with the skills to fight back. Outside, a car alarm wailed faintly through the wreckage of the storm. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Because, Victoria now knew, her survival as CEO and maybe as a mother might depend on the man her company had once written off as invisible. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by afternoon, but the air inside the apartment was still heavy with urgency. Victoria sat hunched at the small kitchen table, her phone buzzing with fresh updates from the board. Every new notification was another strike against her. Daniel placed a stack of papers in front of her, printouts he'd saved from the company's internal database, things most janitors would have never even thought to look at. Contracts, emails, transaction summaries. He spoke calmly, his tone precise. Here's what they're hiding. Shell companies siphoning funds overseas. If we present this before the board, you won't just block the vote, you'll turn their accusations back on them. Victoria skimmed the documents, her brow furrowed. This could work. Daniel leaned closer, his finger tapping one of the pages. Not could, will, but you'll need to be blunt, cut through the noise and name names. Victoria bristled, straightening in her chair. I don't just walk into a boardroom throwing accusations. There's a way to handle these things, my way. Daniel shook his head. Your way is what got you here. Playing nice while they sharpen knives behind your back. Her eyes narrowed. You forget who you're talking to. I'm not used to taking lessons from janitors. The words hit harder than she intended. The fragile alliance cracked. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. Then you'd better get used to losing everything. The air between them sparked with tension. Two people who had just survived looters and stormwinds were now at war with each other. The argument rose, Victoria insisting on preserving her dignity, Daniel demanding brutal honesty as their only shield. Each word pushed them further apart, and then a small voice broke through. Look what I made. Emma stood between them, clutching a crayon drawing. Her cheeks were smudged with color, her hands sticky from markers. She laid the paper gently on the table. Victoria blinked. The picture showed 4 stick figures, Daniel, Emma, Victoria, and her son, all holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, in crooked letters, 2 families together. Silence filled the room. Victoria stared at the page, her throat tightening. She thought of the glass towers she commanded, the allies who had betrayed her, the boardroom smiles that hid daggers. And then she looked at Emma, whose eyes held no agenda, only hope. For the first time, Victoria's voice softened. That's beautiful, Emma grinned. See? You don't have to fight. You can be a team. Daniel exhaled slowly, his anger ebbing. He looked at Victoria, and for the first time, she didn't see a janitor lecturing her. She saw a man standing shoulder to shoulder with her in a fight that mattered. Victoria traced the drawing with her fingertips, her pride melting into something else, resolve. All right, she whispered. We'll do this together. Daniel nodded, the unspoken truce sealed by a child's drawing, but outside the storm clouds hadn't cleared. In the distance, the city skyline flickered, reminders that their true battle still awaited. The glass towers of Hale Enterprises gleamed, again power fully restored, but inside the atmosphere was darker than the storm they had just survived. The boardroom, lined with polished oak and towering screens, buzzed with heated voices. Executives argued in sharp tones, their words ricocheting off the walls. At the far end of the table, Marcus Kane, Victoria's most trusted deputy, sat. With a calculated calm, his fingers steepled, eyes glinting with quiet triumph. Then the doors opened. Victoria Hale strode in, her chin lifted, her son's crayon drawing folded neatly inside her briefcase. But she wasn't alone. Daniel walked in behind her wearing the same worn jacket from the night before. Executives blinked in confusion, then smirked. One whispered, "She brought the janitor?" Another chuckled. Desperate times. Victoria ignored them, her heels striking the floor like a gavel. "Let's begin." The board members pounced. Charts flashed on screens, accusations hurled like knives, neglect, poor leadership, failure to protect company interests during the storm. Every argument had been sharpened overnight. Marcus finally leaned forward. "Victoria, this isn't personal. It's about stability. You've lost control." For a moment, the room tilted against her. Then Daniel stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. His voice was calm, measured. "Actually, it's about corruption." Executives laughed, but the laughter died quickly as he flipped open the folder. Page after page of contracts, offshore accounts, hidden payments. His words cut with surgical precision, dismantling their case point by point. Funds transferred to shell companies registered under board members' families. Backroom deals with investors you claimed were losses. Every accusation you've made against Victoria collapses under the weight of your own signatures. Gasps rippled across the table. Phones buzzed as assistants fact-checked in real time. One executive paled, whispering, "He's right." Victoria seized the moment, her voice sharp as steel. "This is the leadership you claim I lack. Transparency, accountability. And thanks. To Daniel, the truth is out." All eyes turned to Marcus, whose composure cracked for the first time, but he wasn't finished. He shot to his feet, pointing a finger at Daniel. "You can't trust him. This man isn't who he says he is. He's a fraud, blacklisted from law for misconduct. Ask anyone in this city, he doesn't belong in this room." The accusation dropped like a hammer. Executives leaned back, their confidence wavering. The boardroom's energy shifted again, this time dangerously. Daniel didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. The ghosts of his past pressed at the edges of the room, threatening to swallow him whole. Victoria's eyes darted between Daniel and Marcus, the fragile alliance trembling. The silence stretched, suffocating. And then the board chair cleared. His throat. "Well, is it true?" Every eye locked on Daniel. The man who had just saved the company now stood accused in the harshest light. For the first time all night, Daniel's steady voice faltered. The air in the boardroom was suffocating. The silence after Marcus's accusation was thicker than the storm clouds that had blanketed the city the night before. Every eye locked on Daniel, waiting for him to crack. He didn't. Daniel took a slow breath, then stepped forward. "It's true," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the tense room. "I was blacklisted. I was blamed for a corruption scandal I didn't commit. I walked away because I had a daughter who needed me more than the law ever did." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the table. Some executives leaned forward, smelling blood. Others shifted, uneasily in their seats. Marcus seized on it, smirking. "See, he admits it himself. You're trusting a man who couldn't survive his own career." But Daniel didn't flinch. He reached into his worn satchel and pulled out a smaller folder, edges frayed with time. He laid it on the polished table and opened it, revealing documents. Her stamped with dates, signatures, and trails Marcus hadn't expected anyone to keep. "Here's what you didn't tell them," Daniel continued. "The partner at my firm, the one who orchestrated the offshore accounts, wasn't alone. He had help, names that appeared on contracts, emails that never surfaced during the investigation, because someone buried them." He slid a sheet across the table. Executives leaned closer. At the bottom, underlined in black ink, was Marcus Kane's signature. The room erupted, gasps, whispers, the sound of chairs scraping as board members turned on each other. Marcus's smirk faltered, his face draining of color. "This is fabricated," he snapped. "Old paperwork, meaningless." But before he could finish, a calm voice spoke from the far end of the table. "We have seen enough." It was one of the Japanese investors, part of the expansion deal Victoria had been fighting for. His tone was measured, but his words cut with precision. "This man may have scars from his past, but tonight he has shown honor. He does not hide. He does not lie. We value such integrity." The other investor nodded. "We stand with him and with her." He motioned toward Victoria. The shift was immediate. Executives who moments ago mocked Daniel now turned on Marcus, demanding answers. The board chair raised a hand, voice sharp. "Security, escort Mr. Kane out." Marcus exploded from his chair, spitting fury. "You'll regret this, all of you!" But the guards had already grabbed his arms, dragging him from the room as his shouts echoed down the hall. Silence fell once more, broken only by the hum of the city outside. Victoria looked at Daniel across the table. Not at his worn jacket, not at his calloused hands, but at the man who had stood when she was surrounded by knives. For the first time, she didn't see a janitor. She saw an equal. Daniel exhaled, glancing toward the window where the storm clouds were finally breaking. But outside the boardroom, the world was waiting for answers. Cameras, reporters, headlines, none of them would let him hide anymore. The sun broke through the storm clouds for the first time in days, casting golden light across the city skyline. From the 40th floor of Hale Enterprises, the glass walls reflected a world trying to piece itself back together. Daniel stood just inside the CEO's office, Emma's small hand tucked in his. The last time he'd been in this building, he wore a janitor's badge and pushed a mop bucket down polished halls. Now his steps felt heavier, not with shame, but with purpose. Victoria sat behind her desk, the crayon drawing Emma had given, her tucked safely into a leather folder. She rose when she saw them, her son perched on the edge of a chair, swinging his legs. "Come in," she said warmly, a tone Daniel had never heard from her before. Emma squeezed his hand, whispering, "Daddy." "This is her office?" He nodded. "The big one." Victoria motioned to the seat across from her. "Sit down, both of you. I owe you something more than thanks." Daniel hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair. Emma hopped onto his lap, her curious eyes darting between the towering windows and the toys scattered near Victoria's son. Victoria placed a document on the desk and slid it toward him. The title at the top read, Chief Ethics Liaison. Daniel frowned. "What is this?" "It's an offer," she said simply. "Permanent, not janitorial work, not cleaning up after everyone else's mistakes. This is where you belong, ensuring the company never loses its integrity again." For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. His mind flashed to nights spent scrubbing floors, to the hammer clenched in his hand when looters pounded on his door, to Emma's drawings taped to their fridge. He had lived invisible for so long, survival his only goal. Now someone was asking him to step into the light. Emma tugged the paper toward her, tilting her head. "Daddy, that means you're a boss too." Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes stinging. "Something like that." Victoria's son stood, holding a crayon drawing of his own, two figures holding hands beneath a red sun. He walked shyly to Emma, placing it beside hers on the desk. The two papers touched, crooked edges overlapping. "The eye." Children grinned, proud of their shared masterpiece. Daniel looked at Victoria. She met his gaze without the cold mask of power, without the distance of wealth. For once they were simply two parents, standing in the wreckage of storms, both natural and man-made, building something new. He signed the paper quietly. The four of them moved toward the window, silhouettes framed against the morning skyline. Daniel rested his hand gently on Emma's shoulder, Victoria on her son's, no longer invisible, no longer alone, not just survivors of a storm, but a new family. Forged by it, the city stretched before them, alive with light, waiting for the story still to be written.